Hello, everybody. Today I want to review Total Resistance by Major Von Dach. It's the Swiss Army Guide to Guerrilla Warfare and Underground Operations, written in 1957. It was written by Major Hans von Dach in anticipation of a communist invasion of Switzerland. It's instructions for what remnants of the army and the civilian populace should do if they're not only invaded but defeated by communist forces. And the first thing that struck me about this book was the fact of its existence. I feel like history has been largely sanitized of the communist threat. How many people, when they think of the 1950s, think of a world in which a Swiss military figure would write this book about what to do in case of a communist invasion? And it's a really interesting read. It has its place in all special warfare's colleges. When Russia invaded Ukraine a couple years ago, I thought of having this book translated and made available to Ukrainians, and then I realized that it already was translated. And there's what the cover looks like for the Ukrainian version. So anyway, let's get to the contents of this book. It's a lot of very, very practical advice. In the beginning, he writes that guerrilla war is the most brutal phase of the war because that's when one or the other army has been defeated and the populace is fighting for its own survival and with the most desperation. So it'll be the most brutal part of the war. And it's just tons and tons of practical advice. How to hide supplies, strategies for managing your food, saving canned food and food that doesn't spoil, like chocolate, for the winter, how to recruit people, how to do compartmentalized cells of knowledge, how to destroy important targets, like for a train station, for example, or for a fuel depot. He will list the things you should destroy and in what priority you should destroy them. How to deal with counter-guerrilla operations. Interestingly, he writes how to take a beating, and his advice is to lie down near the wall because that way people can't surround you. So instead of having 4 people beating you, there'll be 2 or 3, and they'll be getting in each other's way a little bit more. And he encourages you to protect vital organs. Think about how scary communism was. This is something that is all too easily forgotten, that in Switzerland, of all places, they would be writing this type of book. It's a little bit dated. There's too much emphasis on radio communications and on printing machines to distribute your counter-propaganda. And about propaganda, he says it's very important to at least do something, because if not, you will drown in the enemy's propaganda. So he suggests either scraping the enemy's leaflets and posters that they put up all over the place, and if you can't do that, then put little stickers on them that say nothing but lies. One interesting bit of advice, which I wouldn't have thought of, he talked about the vulnerability of prominent pre-invasion public figures who were critical of the invasion. So like they were journalists and politicians who were outspokenly against communism, and then the invasion happens and you're occupied by the enemy. Not only should you not recruit those public figures, but you should make as public as possible your policy of not recruiting those figures, because he says they'll be very vulnerable to the enemy. So let the enemy know that you're not touching them, because the enemy will likely target those leaders. He talks about youth movements and how the communists will not in one fell swoop outlaw youth organizations and the church and schools, but they'll do it step by step. So they'll promote ridicule of Christianity for a long time to weaken the church's influence. They'll replace old youth organizations with new youth organization. About the whole book, he says that it may seem silly for him to be so public about Switzerland's plan for defending itself if it gets invaded by the communists. But he says that he doesn't see it that way. He wants this information to be as public as possible, so that the communists will know that they're ready for them, and so that people are talking about the resistance that they would put up. And this makes a whole lot of sense, especially if you take into account that the communists were coordinated from Moscow. As I've written in another essay, Russia has a very particular way of war, and I will link to this essay in the footer if you're interested. The Russians have never been good at modern maneuver warfare. They don't seem to have enough trust in each other and in their chain of command. They don't have enough internal trust to have that level of discipline that modern maneuver armies have. Interestingly, they're not also good at peace, because their lack of trust internally prevents them from building a modern economy and having a good division of labor. So they're not good at war and they're not good at peace. So they always strive for this in-between state that's not full-out war and not really peace. They rely heavily on demoralization of their enemies and just using mass when the opportunity arises. So they don't have to fight a maneuver fight. They just overwhelm their enemy with numbers once the enemy is demoralized. And I have two examples that I use to illustrate this. One comes from Tsarist Russia and one comes from Communist Russia, and they're almost exactly 100 years apart. The example from Tsarist Russia comes from how what was Vladivostok was then a Chinese city, and Russia wanted it. It's their historical quest for ports, for ports they have access to the sea. So for 10 years, Russia was massing settlers, or you can call them colonists, as well as military in the general area of Vladivostok on that little peninsula. They were just massing people there, including military people, waiting. And only when China was losing the Second Opium War to Britain and France did the Russians threaten them into just giving up that part of China. So the Russians took it and renamed it Vladivostok. The second example is the Russian military invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria. It happened 2 days after the bombing of Hiroshima. Very, very opportunistic. Some historians say that was just a coincidence. The Russians, as part of the Yalta Agreement, needed to invade Manchuria, but to me it seems like part of a pattern. Same thing, they invaded Crimea just when the time was right, relying on mass, and I think they miscalculated in eastern Ukraine, thinking that Ukrainians were so demoralized that they wouldn't put up a fight. So I like this Swiss major's strategy of advertising your readiness, making defense and preparedness against outside aggression as public and open a topic as possible. And I was very happy to see that this book is translated into Ukrainian and available for free online in quite a few languages. So that's it for this one.